Fidel Castro has stepped down in favor of his brother Raul, but so far, no dramatic change in Cuba, much to the disappointment of Miami's exile community. Powerless to affect the Castro administration on the island, they have great power over Florida and U.S. politics. Where does this small community's supersized influence come from? Miami's Little Havana is the cultural center point for 600,000 Cuban Americans in South Florida. It's a community with a legendary and sometimes decisive impact on American presidential politics. How does one group of people get that much power in America? And with the community inevitably changing, how will that power play out this time around? Those are the questions for this week's Frontline Focus. Here's Monica Villamizar.
When Fidel Castro seized power in Havana, the first waves of Cuban migrants flew to Miami and began to create this place, Little Havana. The Cuban Revolution drove thousands more to American shores, and many have been waiting ever since to see the communist regime overthrown. Fidel may now have retired and his brother Raul has taken his place, but the feeling here is that nothing has really changed.
The only change is the person, the person in power. But it's the same thing. The system is still there. Everything is the same.
For many in this community, the hatred of Fidel that has been there for decades remains as strong as ever.
They talk about Castro, they talk about the embargo. There's mixed feelings about the embargo. About Castro, there are no mixed feelings. They always want to kill him. They always want to make fun of him. You know, they always want to be dead. Then we have the hot sauce, and it's called Burning Hell Fidel. And this is like a conversation piece when you're doing, you know, a barbecue or something like that. We are obsessed about politics because we are outside our country because of politics.
A very strong cultural identity explains why many Cuban Americans come to this street, Calle Ocho, in Little Havana to shop, listen to their own music, and even drink Cuban coffee. This community is thought to be very united when it comes to politics. And this is one of the reasons why their vote is highly courted by politicians and presidential hopefuls. The Café Versalles, one of Little Havana's most famous landmarks and a stronghold for right-wing Cuban Americans, has become a routine stop for political candidates eager to win over this small but well-motivated group of voters. Who are you going to vote for president?
I've seen the majority of the Cubans vote for McCain.
I don't have anything against women. My wife is a woman and an excellent woman. She's the mother of 8 children and 22 grandchildren. But McCain represents manhood. And the way the world is going, we need a man in Washington.
Over 1 million Cuban Americans live in the United States, a majority Republican voting bloc. As an ethnic and ideological group, they have carved out significant influence in Washington.
You want me to expand on it?
Juan Suarez is a businessman who has lobbied for issues important to Cuban Americans. Why do Cubans have so much political power in the United States, being relatively a small minority?
It is a small minority. It's one of the smallest minorities. But we have always been politically motivated. We have been quite active in politics. We have organized lobbies, and we have contributed.
Donations are the second highest in the country after the Jewish pro-Israel lobby. A key achievement of all the lobbying, an economic embargo that Washington has maintained against Cuba since 1962. But the Cuban influence is not only due to financial contributions. The state of Florida is a swing state with a large number of electoral delegates. The way a few voters behave can have a big impact in a presidential election. Journalist Edmundo Garcia is one of the few dissenting voices in this mostly anti-Castro Cuban American community.
This right wing calls themselves the historical exiles. I rather call them hysterical. They don't have a clue what Cuba is. The place they left no longer exists. 95% of Cubans were born under the revolution. People who came after the 80s left family there, and they have some relationship with Cuba.
Edmundo says most of his audience, which is young and born and bred in America, wants to see a change within the Cuban American community. They want to engage with communist Cuba, not destroy it. Ending the 50-year-old Caribbean Cold War and focusing more on American problems is drawing an increasing number of young Cuban Americans towards the Democratic candidates in the presidential race. In particular, Barack Obama, who says he'll at least talk to Cuba's communist leaders.
My generation is not a Castro-centric generation. We are not as concerned about Fidel Castro. We are more concerned about the liberty of Cuba and the freedom of Cuba. We see Fidel Castro and his little brother as an obstacle, but the most important thing to do is to keep the Cuban people in mind.
But the passions of the past still dominate the air for most in this deeply nostalgic community. Hoy como ayer means today like yesterday. For most of the Cuban American community in Miami, despite recent events in Havana, that's the message they still want Washington to hear.
Here in Miami's Little Havana, with the Bush years coming to a close, change is in the air. I sat down with a couple of prominent members of the Cuban Exile community here and got a sense of how things have and haven't changed for them. With us today, Joe Garcia, a former head of the powerful Cuban American National Foundation. He's a newly declared congressional candidate for the Democrats. And Ramon Sanchez, a Cuban exile who despises the government in Havana that says the embargo does not work. It feels like there's a change going on in the Cuban American community. Can you tell me what it feels like to you?
I think in Miami you've got a generational shift. For the first time ever, there are more Cubans that came after 1980 than before. They tend to be younger, they tend to be out more, and so their debate and their discussion is a very different perspective from what, say, my parents or mine who was born in the United States.
Do you see it that way?
I think on top of that, we can add that people are also looking back and saying what has worked and what has not worked. And it is time for change.
The embargo is clearly a broken policy. It's been in place for longer than any other trade embargo on the planet, and it's achieved nothing but misery, essentially, right?
The embargo has afforded Fidel Castro the excuse that everything that fails in Cuba is somebody else's fault. So it has, in a way, helped Fidel Castro maintain himself in the approach that he best likes, which is a conflict between the United States and Cuba.
But this is ironic to me because you guys are pillars of the Cuban American community here. It is the disproportionate influence of your community which has kept this embargo in place in the face of all reason.
But that's not a bad thing. That's the truth is, in a democracy, in a democracy where people have a view, and that view is effectuated by votes, you know, Cubans should have more to say about Cuba.
But they have more power than their numbers would suggest in this country.
No, they have just the right power because they vote. They vote hard, and it's important.
I don't think it has been only the exile community's power that has kept the embargo in force. Remember, historically, the embargo was not put into effect to help the freedom of Cuba. It was put into effect when properties of the United States were confiscated in Cuba by the Cuban regime.
You know, but people outside of North America, many of them see the embargo as simple collective punishment. Israel closes off Gaza because they don't like the government there. They deprive the people there of electricity, of fuel, of food and medicine. That's exactly how many people around the world see the embargo in Cuba. How is it not just collective punishment?
It's very different because in the end, the truth is you can buy all the food, medicine, anything you want anywhere in the world. And you know, Fidel Castro has a great speech where he says, "Ni una aspirina penetra el bloqueo." You know, nobody buys aspirin from the United States in the first place.
So 27% of voters, Hispanic voters in Miami are Democrats. There's some shift going on here. Can you characterize?
Let me give you an example, and it's 27% are Cuban American. And when you add to that in the last 10 years, Republican Cuban Americans used to be 49%. In the last 10 years, they've gone down to 41%, which is over almost a 20-point loss.
So it's clear to you both that the legendary power of the Cuban exile community is starting to shift towards the Democrats.
But that's good. I think Ramon would agree with it.
It strikes me that the Democrats have the best chance of winning the White House in 8 years, and that this is just opportunism.
And the distinction by who? By the Cubans? Or
sure.
By, no,
go where the power is. Now you're all Democrats. No, changes in the air.
No. What it's called democracy. And democracy, you get to choose the future. Look, if a Republican doesn't get over 65% of the Cuban vote, he can't win statewide. That's how important Cubans are to the base of the Republican Party.
I read a quote from a former member of the Cuban American National Foundation that said that Miami has its own foreign minister. Miami has its own foreign policy. Is that part of a democracy for a community to determine that much of a foreign policy?
You don't think that the Jewish community has its own views
I
on
do,
Israel?
and I'm not sure that's very good for a democracy either.
You don't think
I mean, the reason I bring that up is because I think internationally it's perceived that there's a double standard around terrorism in this community and in this country. For instance, you have characters like Orlando Bosch, like Luis Posada Carriles, who have been accused of terrorist crimes. What I'm saying is these guys are heroes in this community.
I disagree strongly with those
accused
people.
of terrorism.
But we disagree strongly with those people, and there is a huge amount of people in this community that disagree with them. You know, they do not represent the vast majority of the exile community.
How do you see the situation in 10 years from now?
Well, I think that the nonviolent movement inside of Cuba is going to become a factor that eventually will force the government to undergo reforms, and it will end up with a democratic system.
I think Cuba is ready to move on. They've paid a horrible price, and I think the people in South Florida and the rest of the Cubans around the world want to help them move forward.
Thanks, guys.
Pleasure.
Welcome back to Frontline USA, coming to you this week from Miami. This is not only one of the most exciting election campaigns in recent memory, it is the most media-saturated campaign in world history. So what do we do with hundreds of hours of talking heads and thousands of miles of newsprint? We uncover the coverage. Here's Election Post with Richard Gisbert.
Thanks, Abby. Welcome to the Election Post. The comeback Clintons have struck again. Hillary Clinton is still in the running for the Democratic nomination, despite, she says, a press corps that's been out to get her.
For everyone who works hard and never gives up, this one is for you.
Texas and Ohio were kind to Hillary Clinton, keeping her campaign alive with narrow wins in the primaries there. However, the media, she charges, have been less kind.
Well, can I just point out that in the last several debates, I seem to get the first question all the time. And I don't mind. I'll be happy to field them, but I do find it curious.
That was one of many complaints Clinton had about the coverage, which is a dangerous game for any candidate to play.
It's a risky strategy. There's an old saying in the U.S. that you don't want to anger someone who buys ink by the barrel.
It makes you look whiny. But apparently, it's worked in one sense.
Media softer on Obama than on Clinton?
And that is that the press has taken a closer look at the question of whether it is biased against Hillary or biased in favor of Obama.
Well, I don't agree with you that they're writing Hillary off. I think the press wants to keep both races running for as long as they possibly can.
It's also possible that these complaints are generating some sympathy and some anger among American women.
And among American satirists.
The media's plan, where are you, Sam?
Oh, I'm at the media's anti-Hillary war room in the Paula Jones Conference Center.
Senator Obama, are you comfortable? Is there anything we can get for you?
No, thank you. I'm fine.
Art imitating life, which then imitated art.
If anybody saw Saturday Night Live, maybe we should ask Barack if he's comfortable and needs another pillow.
It is pretty pathetic.
The candidate was making the most of what the satirical media were saying, since her relationship with the traditional news media is problematic.
The entertainment industry, unlike the news industry, I think probably feels freer to comment on whether there is any media bias. The news industry is likelier to be slower to admit any such bias because it's talking about itself.
I think they're influential because Americans distrust media. They trust the satirists to tell the news. The satirists don't report fact, they report satire. And they're cynical about all politicians.
Senator Obama?
And while political satire works when it contains elements of truth, it does tend to fall short of the full story.
The SNL sketch was broad in certain senses, and it captured a certain kernel of truth, but it didn't really ring particularly true to me. It's not so much this rapturous personal like of Obama, so much as it's being a bit caught up in the palpable power of what the campaign feels like when you're around it.
I don't think candidates handle media. I don't think that that's the right way of thinking of it. Obama is an incredibly gifted politician. He, so to speak, handles the media in the same remarkably gifted way that he handles the electorate. He's a natural in the same way as Bill Clinton was a natural. Hillary is not a natural politician.
But it should also be said that Barack Obama seems to be impressing a number of people besides the media. He's drawing very large crowds. He is seen as a very impressive figure by quite a number of people. So it's not just a media bias.
If there's one thing Hillary Clinton can pin on the media, it's for setting sky-high expectations for her candidacy, then blaming her for failing to meet them.
I think that a lot of the recent coverage that her campaign has been talking about is a narrative about front-runner horse who is doing less well than had been expected after really high expectations that were created in part by the media.
The coverage of the media needs to be understood as a narrative. It began with tremendous promise, and now that promise has disappeared, it's dissipated, and she is being portrayed as a failure.
But if you look hard enough at the coverage of the Clinton-Obama story, all those debates, the ads, the accusations, the votes, the media are showing a clear bias, just not the one Hillary Clinton is talking about. The coverage is heavy on style and conflict and light on substance.
Are the American media being fair to American voters? We really don't see a lot of critical questions about any of these front-runner candidates' records being emphasized by the media.
And that's just not fair. We'll be back next week with another edition of The Election Post here on Frontline USA.
We're almost out of time for this edition of Frontline USA, but before we go, we want to bring you a perspective from outside the Cuban exile experience here in Miami. Every year, thousands of Cubans try to reach Miami by boat and raft. You've seen the famous images so expertly exploited by the Cuban American lobby to keep in place the United States embargo of Cuba. But what's life like on the sharp end of that policy? Frontline USA sent Mariana Sanchez to Havana to find out.
This is the Cuba tourists want to explore. Incredible beaches like Varadero, magnificent buildings in old Havana, or taking a ride in a colorful old car. Cuba has become a magnet for visitors from around the world, except for U.S. tourists. A 46-year-old trade embargo bans them from traveling to the communist island.
I don't know why Cuba, everyone's so bent out of shape about Cuba.
40-year-old Denise from California knew she would be violating the U.S. law when she began preparing for this trip 2 years ago.
I'm not worried about it. I feel like we're going to be honest when we go back in, and if they only can ask us certain questions and we know the answers, and we're not going to be dishonest about it. I feel that Americans should be able to travel wherever they want to travel.
But the U.S. government claims that the embargo is meant to force democratic reforms in the communist island and deprive Cuba from getting resources from the United States.
The travel restrictions not only affect Americans that want to come to Cuba, but for Cubans sometimes it is a painful wait. It is years before they can get a visa to see their families in the United States.
Every day, hundreds of anxious Cubans wait outside the U.S. interest section to get a visa, knowing their chances are slim. The 20,000 yearly visa quota has been reduced because the U.S. government tightened travel restrictions, and Cuban families are paying a high price. Armando says he won't allow his 83-year-old mother, Fela Laura, to apply again because she is overwhelmed with sadness. She has been denied a visa 4 times.
We can only contact our family by phone. We can't even see each other. And this whole separation is a result of the embargo.
Cuban officials call the embargo a blockade and blame it for much of the economic hardships Cubans endure, like shortages of medical supplies and food.
In the year 2000, there was a breakthrough in the embargo. For the first time, American farmers could sell their products to Cuba with some restrictions. But products like these can't be sold to the United States. It's still a one-way street.
Last year, Cuba bought $600 million worth of U.S. products. The United States is Cuba's main food supplier. And these U.S. producers do not want to miss out on the Cuban market. They recently came with California's Agriculture Secretary to sell products like fruits and wine to Cuba. Kirby Jones, president of the U.S.-Cuba Trade Association, says the embargo has put American companies at a disadvantage.
There are foreign companies involved in every aspect of Cuban life and Cuban products. The Spanish are helping manage the port. The bottled water is a joint venture with Nestle's from Switzerland. The beer with the companies from Canada. The oil exploration with the companies from India and China and Norway and Spain and Canada. Everybody else is here, and the U.S. has lost out on certain sectors.
Cuban American politicians in the U.S. argue Cubans suffer under a dictatorship. For decades, their influence has been key to keeping the embargo. Cuba's agriculture vice minister says that the embargo is hypocritical.
Our hope is that the blockade is lifted and that we will be finally treated as they treat other countries. They lifted the ban on Vietnam. They have relations with other socialist countries, yet they keep the embargo on us.
And so the Cuban people say they are fed up with the politics from either side. They want to see their families, and they say they are hungry to attract the huge American market to this Caribbean communist island.